Plenary is going to be about shrinking smartly. So basically, shrinking smartly, managing population decline in cities and regions. And this is a really important topic because by and large, and especially in Europe, but also in Korea, Japan, China, and certain other countries, most of the regions and cities will be facing population decline in coming decades. And there is this common perception that population decline is mainly a rural feature, but that's actually not true. Even at the moment, I mean, over the last decade, there's roughly 1 city in 5 that's been faced with population shrinking, and that number is even going to get bigger going forward. And then also the situation is that at least until some year ago, and in certain areas that's still the case, there has been really a state of denial by the policymakers. I mean, when they were faced with the issue of population decline, they were saying, oh, we're going to become more attractive, we're going to build a kindergarten, or we're going to do whatever, and then we'll be so attractive that all the people will come, and then we will not have population decline anymore. And while that may be working for some individual places, generally when you're in a situation where your country is facing a shrinking population and an aging population, I mean, then basically, I mean, most of the regions and most of the cities will also be facing shrinking populations. So this denial is not really helping. But that's one of the reasons why 4 or 5 years back we started a major program in the OECD to thinking about population decline, and also with the idea of basically starting to convince policymakers that this is a very serious topic and that this really needs to be taken serious. And we're seeing, I mean, not just because we've been doing that, but also, I mean, the Commission has been working at other institutions as well. And so we're now seeing that they actually, the question of how do you manage population decline is taking much more serious in the policy community, and a lot more places are interested in thinking about it and preparing for it, and that's a very good situation. And one of the reasons why we're doing this panel here is also kind of like trying to reinforce, I mean, this tendency to get basically more people interested in looking at that issues. And here the semi-plenary basically brings together people from academia and from the policymaking community who are at the forefront of thinking about population decline and managing demographic change more generally. And the discussion is supposed to be looking at what policymakers are supposed to be doing going forward, but also where are the areas where further research would be helpful. And by and large, I mean, must be said that it's not just the policymakers who have been a bit blind to the issue, but it's also the academic community who has not been doing a whole lot of research on the topic, and there's a lot of areas that are still, I mean, usually under-researched. So basically, I also encourage everybody in the room to think about maybe whether you or your students would not be well advised to kind of like look a bit more at those issues going forward. So the general questions we're trying to answer in that panel is basically what do we know about today's and tomorrow's demographic challenges in different cities and regions, because obviously different places having very different situations. And then also what can national, regional and local governments do to prepare, and how can the academic knowledge help in that. And for that panel I have with me Anne Goujon, who is from the IIASA, and he's basically the program director of the Population and Just Societies program. Then further to my left we have Andrea Conte from the GRC, who's team leader there, and he's basically bringing in the dimension, the views from the European Commission. Then on my right there is Josefina Sistner, who is he's professor at Linköping University and at the Center for Local Government Studies. And then all the way on the right, there's Jae-Bom Cho, who is from the OECD and who is one of the persons who's leading the work on demographic change that we're undertaking there. So with that, Anne, what are the trends across the world and its different regions and cities when it comes to population developments?
Thank you very much, Rudiger. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to be with you. The major trends are actually very well known, so I'm going just to give you in a few minutes a global demographic picture, which may not bring many news to you. So as you know, the world is going through the demographic transition, so going to low birth rate and low mortality rate. So according to the projections that we just released, or my institute is doing projections, we know that the rate of population growth, which is at the moment of 1%, would decline to 0.5% by 2050, and most likely be negative at the end of a century, around minus 0.2%. So of course, and this will result in the world population to increase from 8 billion today to 10.1 billion in 2080, and they will start declining to be 9.9 billion. So another, let's say, 2 billion individuals on this planet by the end of a century. And of course, what we know, and that's also what we're interested in this conference, is that not all regions in the world are developing demographically at the same rate. And there is a broad palette of demographic dynamics. So if we look at the 22 world regions, like at our very broad regions, at present and until, let's say, 2030, there are only 3 world regions that are declining in population. And this is Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and East Asia. Between now and 2050, there will be 4. So there will be the addition of Western Europe, which will also start declining. Between 2050 and 2100, there will be about 10 regions that will be shrinking. And these include countries regions all over the world, so from Latin America to South Asia, and also Northern Europe. So now, having said that, what we know is that most of the world population until the end of the century will happen in sub-Saharan Africa. So 3/4 of the world, 3/4 of population growth will happen in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in my mind, in my demographic vision of the world at the moment, there are certain trends that merit attention. I mean, one, why you are also here, is that having negative population growth in a region or in a country doesn't mean having negative population growth all over the place. So there are regions that are increasing and regions that are declining, and vice versa. So the game changers are, of course, internal and international migration and urbanization. However, there is also some nuance to bring to that element, and this is something that we see, for instance, in low and middle income countries, where often we think that migration is the main reason for increase in urban population in low and middle income countries, which is not true. The main reason is that the decrease in mortality rate in those countries. So it's natural growth that is bringing urban population to increase. So bringing us to this urban, so today most of the world lives in urban areas, about slightly over 50%. There will be 2/3 by 2050. There is emergence of megacities, as we know. There were 3 megacities in 1950. Now there are about 33 nowadays. So megacities being cities with more than 10 million population, and most of them are in low and middle income countries, except for Tokyo and a few others. And there's a huge increase in the population living in urban slums. So like out of the 8 billion population nowadays, like 1 billion lives in slums, which is a huge number. My last 2 points is that like urban population, like cities have an important impact on environmental change. So that cities are the place where greenhouse gases emissions are the strongest, which is important. And cities are the engines of growth and the engines of innovation. And this is also something to be remembered. And I think like that's the picture I would like to give at the moment, and I'll give you back the floor if you have any further question at this stage.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Then we will come to Andrea. And I mean, you basically mentioned that, I mean, Europe and certain parts of Asia are the parts of the world that are, for the time being, most strongly affected by population decline. And so, Andrea, what can you tell us, about Europe in this respect? I mean, what are we seeing in Europe, and how does shrinking affect the different regions' economies in Europe?
Thanks, Rudiger. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, I would like to mention how important and central is the debate on demography vis-à-vis major trends we are witnessing as analysts in other areas, from economic policy to public choice to political economy to technological development and so on. An older society, a shrinking society that responds differently to challenges faced by globalization, competition, innovation. It's important that for the overall dynamics of a territory, the political choices, this type of debate becomes more and more central. Where do we stand at the moment in terms of political issues? We will have elections, the European election back in June. Basically, we are celebrating in 2023 30 years of cohesion policy. So we are somehow at an important anniversary also to take stake of the general trend we have been witnessing over time. Today we are in Hungary. 2024 is the 20th anniversary of the biggest enlargement of the European Commission to what we call it at the time, the new member states, the EU 13. Countries that have benefited a lot from enlargement. If we look at statistics from GDP growth to employment creation to gross fixed capital formation, are countries that have been heavily converging, but in which, for instance, demographic issues are core to some of the debates in national politics that are happening here. Exactly because demography, beyond economics, is somehow shaping economics, is there affecting the way in which collective groups, society responds to challenges. So where do we stand? I will give you some hints. Actually, this discussion is coming 1 month after the publication of our Commission in-depth report on cohesion policy. Last month we had the publication of the cohesion report published by colleagues in DG Regio, where us as a joint research center have contributed substantially through the analytics and through the kind of territorial intelligence that we provide in this case. So if you want to have a more comprehensive picture, of course, I can only suggest you to have a look to that interesting publication that provides the overview of the state of play of the current dynamics. But there are some elements that, in my view, are important to mention. And we will go later into more the issue and the interplay between demographics and other elements. The key elements. Population growth in the EU has been slowing for decades. So we are not witnessing a recent trend. There is a general tendency which is also projected to last. So in that sense, we cannot easily think to revert some trends that are back since basically, I would say, the origin of the statistical data that we are using at subnational level. So the first message is that it's not a temporary phenomenon, the one that we are witnessing, but it's something that is substantial, structural, that actually was accelerating due to COVID. Now it's a bit going to the long-term normal trend, but is there to stay. There is no easy solution in the sense that since 2012, the slowdown accounts for a negative decline in population. While we had from basically the 60s a reduction in the rate of growth of the population, now we are into a negative territory. Migration is not compensated for this. Migration will not probably compensate for this. The projections that we are doing as a joint research center together with Eurostat at the regional level, as soon at the local level as well, points to a picture in which many areas, more area in the future than in the past, will need to face this general slowdown. Other major historical trends like migration will not provide an easy solution. So the first element to take into account is this. The second one is the potential economic effects that a slowdown population, a slowdown in the working age population has on the overall economic dynamics. Dependency ratio is increasing a bit everywhere. The feeling of shrinking society is more common than we could generally thought. Basically, 40% of the European population is closely related to a shrinking community. So it's something that is important to take into account. When the workforce is shrinking, of course, there are major policy dilemmas that emerge in terms of provision of public services. There is a nice OECD report back from 2021 in which there is a discussion on access to service, fairness in access to services, especially education and health in remote area, rural area. And the interplay between a shrinking population and the urbanization versus rural area dynamics is at the core of the major maps that we are witnessing around. Now, on rural, because I think it's something quite relevant, there are 37 million of people in the European Union that live in a remote area, basically almost 1 out of 10. There are some functional classification of what a rural area is. Actually, I'm thinking about a subsample of this, the remote rural area, where most of the problems are concentrated. But basically, if we develop in a kind of mental matrix the interplay between the increasing dependency ratios and the dynamics that brings to cities to be in a better position to answer to those type of challenges, also because taking advantage of the internal migration that is happening within member states, between member states as well. You see that the combination of this phenomenon brings to very territorial asymmetric problems, especially in those areas like the remote rural areas that touch almost one third of all the EU municipalities, 32%. The challenge there becomes then a challenge of identifying a potential policy response. And this will be the topic of our next round of table, but basically, next round of questions. But basically, what is important to signal is that there are structural weaknesses that still nowadays hamper the possibility for those areas of being attractive. Only 2% of what we call it remote rural area have a GDP above basically the EU average. So the vast majority is lagging behind. It's lagging behind not only in terms of GDP, but basically across almost all the indicators that matter for attractiveness and structural development. If you take the statistics on skills, the statistics on the working age population, the productivity per person, the sectoral composition, basically you will see that they are lagging behind in many respects. There is a strong focus, as we all know, on the digital transition. Here I would like to give, before ending, a kind of dual message, a bit more sorrow on the digital, where we still see the major delays in implementation of the digital agenda and the right to broadband connectivity for everybody. It's basically there where the problem is concentrated. Basically, the last statistics indicate that more than 45% of the rural areas don't reach the EU target of 30 megabytes. Basically, 60 million inhabitants in remote rural area are still using internet with low speed. Now, try to square this information with the discussion on attracting remote workers and how this can be made feasible. But on the positive side, I want to end up with a report made by my colleague in Directorate B in the Joint Research Center. There is a big potential for rural areas to go beyond sustainable tourism, which is considered somehow the kind of easy solution for development of those areas. Tourism is one potential solution, but absolutely will not provide a long-term, sustainable, stable, I would say, development trajectory for those territories. We have a potentiality of energy, renewable, the capacity to use those areas as the engine for technological innovation development, especially in terms of energy production under the green agenda. Basically, photovoltaic systems in rural areas, the lagging behind areas, basically have the potential to generate already 60 times more of the current production. Last estimate on offshore wind indicate that there is the possibility of generate 4 times more. This is a potential avenue in which we could try to link territories for the economic development and the green transition at the EU.
Well, thanks a lot, Anna and Andrea. I think you have seen that the situation is really very different in different parts in the world, on the one hand, but then also the situation is very different within countries, and I can maybe just add some statistics that we've been recently calculating in the OECD, which are basically showing that the problem of shrinking, if you're looking at cities, has very much to do with the city size. Statistically speaking, you're much more likely to have, negative or, very slightly positive, population developments when you're a smaller city, whereas when you're a relatively large city, you probably still have growing populations even going forward. And also on the rural side, you have very different situations. You have the remote regions where often, typically, you have declining populations, but on the other hand, the rural regions close to the bigger agglomerations, they're usually doing quite well, and they typically often have population growth rates even surpassing the ones that you're seeing in the bigger cities. With that, we're at least for the moment basically closing the discussion on the population side and moving more towards the policy side. And I wanted to ask you, Joe, are the governments really preparing to shrink smartly? And can you just, say some words, on this topic, especially looking at the issues of planning and land use and associated problems?
Yes, thank you, Rudiger, and thank you for inviting us to speak today. Yes, I guess I'll be discussing a bit on the implications of depopulation from the built environment side. So in terms of actually how depopulation and demographic change is affecting how we live and how we use our land and how we use our buildings. In terms of some of the key issues that depopulation results in is the first one is what we call oversized infrastructure. So, before, if you had infrastructure networks that were planned and managed for 100 people, and then suddenly gradually you have 60 or 70 people that are using the same amount of infrastructure. The thing is that, of course, infrastructure networks, there is the issue of economies of scale. So the less and less people that are using the infrastructure, the more inefficient the infrastructure networks become, which is an issue, especially for the local governments and the municipalities, because you have to remember that their fiscal revenues and tax revenues are going to be declining into the future as they depopulate. So that's one of the main problems that we have to address. Another problem is the issue of empty housing and more in general, the degrading of our built environments, which is sort of related to the fact that because these municipalities are strapped for resources and finance and fiscal resources, a lot of the times you see that these empty housing in the middle of nowhere, they're left as they were empty for for a long time, and so they're not dealt with. And this can lead to what at the OECD at what we call the geography of discontent, as in people that are living in these communities and these neighborhoods. They feel a sort of a discontent towards not only their own built environments, but in general their local governments and then the national government as well. And so there's the issue about how the quality of the built environments actually results in a deteriorating and a more general sense of place at the neighborhood level. And then, of course, I think it's important to stress that there are environmental implications as well to demographic change, is that basically, if you think about what depopulation is it's a fewer number of people living on the same area of land, which means that in general, the efficiency of land use is going to go down. And that has implications for environmental sustainability, because one, in these declining areas, there is a high dependency on cars. There's also, on a per capita basis, there's greater emissions because, for example, the utility networks and providing for energy to these households that are spread out thinly across space is going to require, has a greater environmental footprint. So having said that, I think Andrea and Rudiger mentioned quite well that these demographic challenges are not equal across space. You see, if you take a look at the actual, like for example, the grid level data, you see that even in countries where populations are shrinking, in many cases, especially near the peripheries of large urban centers, you see a continual expansion of built-up area. And that's partially due to the fact that the people that were originally in these depopulating areas are now seeking to move towards these larger urban centers in search for amenities and opportunities. So because, I mean, also if you think about development in the periphery, it's usually the case that these types of developments are very, very low density, and in many cases the developments aren't situated near transit corridors, which again puts the environmental footprint, environmental impact of these developments, they're increased. So I think if I can stress one thing when it comes to depopulation and the built environment is that there really needs to be a shift in terms of land use, in that we really need to be a bit more efficient going into the future, and we need to densify our built environment and our residential areas. We need to do that because densification in general, it improves the efficiency of infrastructure. It also partially alleviates the issues that we have with empty housing and maintaining our built environments. It's also more sustainable, and it's cheaper to maintain. So I mean, in terms of the OECD data, I mean, already since the year 2000, 1 in 4 OECD regions have seen a decline in population. And by 2050, 2/3 of all OECD regions are going to be declining. But I mean, if you on the other side, if you take a look at the amount of built-up area across these years, there's not one single region in the OECD or in anywhere in the world where the amount of built-up area has actually managed to decline. So I think I'll just wrap up by saying that when it comes to land and buildings and real estate in general, I think it's very sticky, because I mean, once you make a decision, the decisions are there until for a very long time. And so in order to mainly address the demographic challenges that we're going to be facing in the future, we really have to start acting now. So I just want to emphasize that point before I give it back.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, thanks a lot, Jay. Well, I mean, Jay has basically just made it clear that we actually know what needs to be done. But to be honest, I mean, we're not seeing a whole lot of these things happening for the time being. I mean, as Jay was saying, I mean, there's places where population is declining, but in spite of population decline, typically the built-up surface is growing. So, Josefina, maybe you can give us a bit of an idea, why is it so hard for local governments to adapt in a well-planned way to all these changes? And what can, knowledge organizations, GRC, YASA, OECD, or the universities, what can we do to basically, help the local governments, or more generally the governments, to make these transformations?
Thank you. Just for a short background, I did participatory research in remote rural shrinking areas for the last 10 years, and it's against this background that I would like to discuss why is it so hard, why do they have the problems they have to adapt. And first of all, I would say that planning for a shrinking society is not to plan for just a smaller society. It is the plan, as you said, for another society, where you have other service needs, where the service has to be located elsewhere, where the civil society is different than in a growing society, where you have not only a weaker tax base, but you have also other financial structures, and they need knowledge in order to cope with this, of course. And due to the consequences of decline, we want local governments to plan for decline. And that is something that scholars of shrinkage has talked about for like 2 decades, 3 maybe. And we have studies from Europe, from Northern America, from Australia, from Asia, Australia, saying that local governments, they do adapt. They do adapt to shrinkage, but they do it in an ad hoc way. They do not do that in a long-term way. They do not do that in a planned and explicit way. And the question, as you asked, why? Why is it so hard? Why do they have so hard times doing that? And I would say that rather than just blaming local governments for not planning in a sufficient or in a transparent way, we need to understand why. Why is it so hard for them to do this? And I would say that first, we have the stigma that you talked about. And perhaps now that when we have another situation, like maybe 1 or 2 decades ago, when we actually have big cities, world cities, that have declining birth rates, perhaps that will maybe ease up the stigma a little bit. So when I meet local governments from rural areas who are a bit sort of, they feel that they did something wrong, they still feel stigmatized, it actually helps them to know that they are not alone. But apart from the stigma part, I would say that I would like to raise 3 factors that makes it hard for local governments to adapt in a planned way. First, I would say that we know that growth brings particular benefits, especially for public finances and especially in the short run. We know that growth is better for public finances in the short run than decline is. And I of course agree on the downsides of growth and the impossibilities of eternal growth within planetary boundaries. But nevertheless, from a public finances perspective, it's very hard to plan for decline. There is also this growth norm that ascribes values to growth that are maybe emotional or affective. To govern a growing city is sometimes seen as governing or leading a winning team. You want to be the leader of a winning team rather than of a loser. So the idea of declining areas or depopulating areas as losers is of course one reason. And then the second reason why it is so hard to plan for depopulation is its temporal dimensions. The unplanned and gradual nature of demographic change. It is like formulating effective strategies in a slow burn crisis. It's harder than doing it in a very rapid crisis where you have to turn all your attention to one issue at the one time. And you also have the mandate periods. I visited so many municipalities who had declined for like 40, 50 years, but they have 3 or 4 years of periods of time to actually do something. So political time and demographic time is 2 different things. It's also that we know that if we are about to adapt services of general interest, we do that in episodes. We cannot close like 10% of a school if we lose 10% of the pupils. We cannot, the adaptation is done in episodes, whereas the demographic decline is continuous. So that's also one reason for why timing is so hard. When is the right time to do an adaptation? When is the right time to adapt? And that also is also extra hard against the background that local governments, local decision makers always have the hope of a turnaround, of a demographic shift, of if we just work hard enough, we will reverse the trend and start growing again. And third, of course, I would say it's both external and internal pressure that prevents local governments from addressing population decline. And this pressure emanates not only from the citizens. I mean, the citizens want politicians who promise growth. They do not want politicians to promise decline or adaptation. And if you are brave enough to address decline, you can be sure that there is always another party who come with a better and more promising solution. So the pressure to go for growth is immense on local government representatives, even if they, as Lisa Schatz in a very prominent article wrote, even if they at a daily basis have to manage decline. So maybe in the next round I can talk more about what we can do as scholars and knowledge organizations to help local governments plan for further population decline.
You want to say so much about that?
Yeah, I can, if I can, I have the microphone, so that's nice. Yes, I would say that one thing, what OECD does right now is actually to normalize population decline as a planning condition. I would say that's the most important thing, to say that population decline is as normal or as as a planning condition that is on par with population growth. And if I ask students when I meet them, how many of you studied a course in urban planning, planning for growth? All of them raised their hand. If I ask them, how many of you took a course in planning for decline in declining regions? No one raised their hand, because we at the universities are very bad at presenting population decline as a planning condition. So that is something that we could do. I would also say that we could help to clarify and verbalize and acknowledge those conflicts that comes with shrinkage. I'm a bit reluctant to talking about innovative solutions and smart shrinkage, because that gives at hand that this will be a win-win situation where nobody will give up anything. I think we have to be honest, at least as scholars, that declining resources, declining populations will lead to conflicts when it comes to localities, interests, values, etc. And we can help to bring them to the table in an organized manner rather than avoiding talking about them.
You know, what we're trying to do at the OECD is to convince the policymakers that what should matter is not basically how many people there are in any given place, but that all the people who are there, they actually have a good life and can basically do what they want and have good amenities and good health in schools and so on and so forth. And that obviously may be a bit more difficult when you're doing that in a situation where, as you're saying, I mean, your population is especially progressively declining. It's like you're saying, like farming 10% of some amenity, some school or some hospital, obviously is not possible. But generally speaking, I mean, there have been larger and smaller cities, I mean, everywhere, all the time. And living conditions, by and large, I mean, countries have striven and also, by and large, managed to have comparable living conditions in different cities of different sizes. Obviously, we have somewhat different amenities. I mean, obviously, if you're like in the countryside, I mean, you have more green space. If you're like in a big city, you have an opera, which you probably don't have if you're in a village. But I mean, there's still a quality of life that can be achieved in all types of places. And so in a way, that's maybe also a way forward to sell to policymakers, that they increasingly focus on, you know, the quality of life rather on basically, you know, counting their sheep, and then kind of like, I mean, being very unhappy when they're seeing the herd decrease, basically. I was thinking it would be good maybe to coming back a bit to the possibilities that the governments have actually to stem the tide by encouraging fertility, migration, or both, because I mean that's something that's still very much evoked. And even when we're talking, you know, about, you know, shrinking smartly to policymakers, a lot of them basically, I mean, reply to us, yeah, what we're going to do is kind of like make sure that we're having more kids, and then we're going to be really attractive. All the migrants come to us, and then we're not going to be declining. And well, the issue is kind of like, I mean, demographics is a bit of a bitch, basically, because I mean, once you have a certain population structure, that, I mean, you're very much bound by it. And maybe you can say some more words about that.
Yeah, thank you. I come from the country where the president recently said that he's aiming for rearming demographically France. So and many demographers were laughing about that. So the answer to whether there is a solution in increasing fertility and increasing migration is actually no, there is not. So we see fertility is plunging to low levels. Almost everywhere, so it's very low in East Asia. We have the example of South Korea nowadays, where fertility is below 0.8 children per woman. Japan, China, even China, where now there's a freedom to have more children, and fertility has increased a bit, but not very much. It is actually again declining. And even more interesting is that it's happening as well in countries where we thought they would be resistant to a fertility decline, like France and Sweden, where for a long time there was this saying that there was this culture of having children, women still being able to work, having all the facilities and so on. And this, even in these countries, we see that fertility is declining. Maybe it's declining slowly, but it's still declining. So it seems very hard to turn the trend around, and the causes are multiple, I think, and they are different whether you consider, for instance, East Asia and you consider Europe. But let's say, I mean, the main causes are related to insecurity, whether they are financial, economic insecurities, environmental insecurities, so global change is worrying young people. Also, I mean, to do with geopolitical. So nowadays, I mean, you hear more and more in the intention to have birth that it's an issue. Like, should you bring a child in this world where security is not guaranteed? There is an increase in individualism and materialism, which has changed the norms that we had before, and there's a theory which is called the low fertility trap theory, where when you reach a certain fertility level, which is like of ultra low fertility, let's say around 1.3, then it's very difficult to go back. So here where we are in Hungary, the government has implemented some policies to increase fertility, and has been partially successful. So fertility has increased by 25%, for instance, in the last 10 years, let's say, but it's far from being to the level of replacement. On top of that, in a country where immigration is very important. And that's also the point. So whether migration, whether it's internal or international migration, can compensate for fertility decline. And what we see, it's not possible, first of all, because migrants aged as well, so they also become older and retire, so they're not going to compensate. And in a study that we did at the GRC, actually, with your sister, we showed that while a majority of regions actually benefit from positive net migration, I mean, coming from international or internal migration, it's in a few cases enough to compensate for the decline in labor force that is due to natural decline. So it's like thinking of larger migration streams to come, for instance, to Europe to compensate seems very unrealistic, especially when we see the way it's going. So like it's not at the moment, governments are not opening up borders. I think they are more like closing them up. So this is unlikely to be true. So if, like, just to conclude, I think, like, and it's a bit shooting myself in the foot, but I think while many of the challenges that our regions are facing today are demographic, I think that the solutions to these problems are not demographic. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Can you say, thanks a lot, I mean, that's very interesting. Can you say something more about, you know, I mean, the age pyramid, basically, you know, I mean, that basically, you know, I mean, that we'll have shrinkage basically just by the fact that there's a whole lot more of old people around who will eventually die. And then basically, if we went back to something like a fertility rate of 2, which I mean, I think is extremely unlikely to happen anywhere. But even if we did that, I mean, what would be the time frame that it would take to basically compensate for the decline that we're currently facing because of the age structure to kind of like, you know, basically, I mean, are we talking about like 20 years or 50 years or 80 years before that would actually be kicking in?
Yes, so it would take a very long time. So it goes both ways. Huh? So it's also the case like in these countries that are growing very fast, and if we would just drop to replacement fertility level now, it would take still a long time for these countries to have a declining population growth because there is this mass of young people who can have children. And the same is true on the reverse. So even if now, like all women would start, all fertile women in the age group 15-49 would start to have 2.1 children, let's say, to fix its number, it would still take, I don't have a number in my mind, but I think it would take at least 30 years until we would see an effect. So you would have to have these children that are born now to become again at the age of fertility. Another thing that I wanted to add to what I said, and I forgot, is as well a reason for this decline in fertility is the life course that how we live nowadays. So especially like in high-income countries where people study for very long, so everything is postponed. So like men, women study for very long until they are 25. They enter the labor force if they are lucky, but sometimes with also some time lag where it's difficult to find a job. Then they secure some kind of employment that is where their career is on a good track, and then they will start to have children. And this is something deterrent for having many children nowadays, because then they will be maybe 35, the fertility is going to be, the fecundity is going to be diminished for women especially, but also for men. So this is something also, I mean, it's not like the solution, but if we need to think of a way to live differently, we have to adapt the life course to also these different elements.
I don't know, I mean, whether you're a specialist on that, but came to my mind. I mean, the decreasing fertility, to what degree it may also be a consequence that we're having a more polluted environment that may basically decreasing fertility rates of men and women. Is there any evidence on that?
There is some evidence on quality of sperm, like pollution is decreasing the quality of sperm in all countries. So this has been shown. There are some studies that are being shown. I mean, whether it is the main effect, the main reason for declining fertility at the moment, I don't think so. I think it's still marginal, but it doesn't mean that it won't increase, but it's also one of the impact, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I mean, when we're having, the issue of declining populations, we should not talk about it as a problem, because we should say it's a normal state in a country or in a continent where basically population overall is declining. But still it may be creating, issues at a different scale in different places. May that further increase the inequality, the spatial inequality we are seeing in Europe? May that be something that may actually be a further barrier to achieving convergence in Europe? And if so, what do we need to do to basically get back to a better level of conversion? We have been showing in the OECD that I mean, there's a lot of conversion in Europe when you're looking basically at the different countries. But when you're looking within a given country, then in a lot of countries there actually hasn't been convergence. Often there has been divergence between the richest and the least rich regions in the country, basically. Can you say some words about that?
Yeah. Actually, I would like to start exactly on this type of evidence. So in the cohesion report, there is a clear indication. I was mentioning the enlargement back in 2004 of overall convergence at the EU level, driven by the between country performance, especially of Central Eastern European new member states. The picture within member states is pretty different. Of course, there is a strong interplay with the urbanization, GDP per capita dynamics that we were mentioning at regional level, which are again based on the overall economic structure of a given territory, which is again based on the demographic structure behind. Now, the projection we have for 2030 indicated basically 25% of the EU27 population will be aged over 65 in 2030. Basically, if we are going to look around us in 2030, 1 out of 4 persons will be over 65, basically close to exit the labor market. This is a fundamental issue. The increase in the average median age at NUTS2 level is, in some territories, going to a very fast pace. Actually, we will have some regions that will be reaching almost 50 years old of median age in 20 years' time, which is a dramatic shift in the structural composition of those territories. Now, look at this group. Let's look around us. Let's imagine that we are in a situation of this aging population, not the EU level, but just let's think to some extreme territories. Imagine again that this is the interplay with being left out. The concept of remote rural area basically overlaps geographically with this demographic transition. And let's reflect on what does it entails in terms of potential political preferences, fiscal choices made by governments that are supposed to represent those collective groups and takes decisions on their behalf, as well on the technological appeal of the world in which those territories will live. Now, there will be an issue, for instance, of the redistributive elements in fiscal policy, especially when we look at intergenerational dynamics. Groups that will lose the capacity to look far beyond, and they will lack, especially because the younger are becoming more and more a minority into that composition, to be represented in the decision that the fiscal level will incentivize their potential growth. This reflects to many domains of public expenditure, from education, but let's look to the more forward-looking type of dynamics, the approach to research innovation, which delivers results in 30 years. We will need to mobilize a consensus that will become increasingly difficult in those territories in which, for obvious reasons, this time horizon will become more difficult to become part of the mainstream. Colleagues have mentioned before the issue of childcare facilities. You know, there is the Barcelona target that was basically under revision back in 2022. But it's a target on childcare facility that was established back in 2002. I basically indicate the regions in the EU should target the provision of childcare facility to children aged under 3 in 1 case out of 3 at the minimum, and for children aged under 6 in 90% of the cases. Now, as you can imagine, in some regions, and not by chance in those regions where the average median age is higher, the appetite for childcare facilities is lower. But this is an extremely counterproductive type of incentive mechanism, because basically we are kicking out women from the labor market. Basically, if you overlap the maps on age, childcare facilities, and labor market participation of female groups, then you can even disentangle this by skills. But basically, you will see that many territories, they are in a kind of fertility trap driven by public policy choices that makes getting out of this quite difficult. We have mentioned the issue of migration. I would like to go back to this topic. As I mentioned before, the projections we have indicate that we don't have an easy solution at the aggregate level at the EU on migration itself. But this is not a scapegoat for member states, regions, and local cities, which actually should try to get people coming to live in those places by targeting, irrespective of nationality or whatever, the brightest and the best in order to increment the capacities of those territories to grow. It's something that is very telling. I like to repeat to myself from time to time, is that the incentives to bring people from the outside to live in your own place are amazingly aligned to the needs of the people living in those territories. I recall an article from The Economist back now many years ago, but basically we were in the middle of the Syrian war. And this was this great article showing how the people in the city of Barcelona, especially in the periphery, were very keen to welcome Syrian migrants, which you all know were among the brightest migrants. There was a flow, an exodus of people escaping from the civil war, while at the same time they were staging a kind of, let me say in brackets, war against Airbnb. And you see in this example of the people living in Barcelona a kind of alignment of incentives. With this example, where do I want to get? Basically, if we are able as a public policy to define the right incentives for people to move, the issue of digital, which I was mentioning before, is hampering dramatically the possibility of remote area to welcome people, smart workers, to move there. If we are able to work on these incentives and provide the local and public authorities with the mechanism for aligning the incentives of the residents and the incentives of the would-be residents in those places, the attractivity of places will be extremely high. This will come anyway at some cost. I want to go back to the issue of the smart working. We have witnessed through the pandemic, we had this quite massive experiment on new working methods. And now there are, in the academia, many studies popping up on whether this has been conducive to more productive solution, less productive solution, more career for the people working remotely or no, all those kind of things. Of course, each dimension, each phenomenon, each policy choice brings could bring an assessment under many dimensions. And of course, not all the dimensions will point into the direction of being a positive novelty or a negative one. Definitely, so I stick to the issue of territorial capability and the potential for attractiveness. Definitely the capacity to intercept remote working could be conducive to grow for lagging behind areas, because there is a strong, amazing, powerful mechanism in play in those areas. In as shrinking societies in which there are the brightest moving away, the older stay there, there is the lack of local examples of excellence. Let me use a bit of rhetorics. Those areas sometimes, also because are reinforced by the stereotypes induced by media, tends to be the area in which nothing is happening. If you want something to happen, you should move to the big city or eventually to another country. The possibility to arrange a different type of work in which we are geographically not setting things to zero, because we will never be the case, but giving the possibility through digital technology, interconnectiveness, to bring some of this excellence to those territories, will have a strong reinforcing mechanism at the local level. It's an area beyond the funding on which we concentrate most of our talks, being EU funding, national funding, regional funding, but it's an area in which we need to put specific attention, because sometimes good examples are examples that can be replicable. In this case, we need the replicability in the territory where people can witness that there is the possibility to do something there.
Thanks, Andrea. I mean, I think it's good that you also kind of like, elaborated a bit on the problem of aging, which obviously is very closely correlated to the part of shrinking, because typically it is in those places where you're having stagnating or declining populations where you're also having the strongest aging effects. And so in a way, these two things are reinforcing each other, and obviously one without the other. If you're just trying to deal with one without looking at the other, then you're not really going to find solutions, so you need to see them as a package. The other point I wanted to make is that obviously, when we are in the OECD, basically trying to get people's attention to managing population decline, then we're obviously not against them trying to make their places more attractive or trying to kind of like, attract migrants or things like that. That's obviously very positive, and that's what they should be doing. They should just be kind of like aware how much they actually will be able, to get out of that, and not have unrealistic expectations. And that's the point we're trying to make. And with that, basically, I'd like to give the floor again back to Jay. You've been talking about the land use related policies that need to be undertaken at local level to deal with shrinking populations, but there's obviously also going to be other issues, for example, such as infrastructure provision or service provision that have been mentioned by several of you before, that are things that need to be addressed. Maybe can you say something on those issues? And also, obviously, it's getting more difficult to invest when you have a declining tax bases. So what are the solutions when you're facing all these constraints?
Yes, thank you, Rudiger. I think I ended on my point was that we really should be acting now in order to address the demographic challenges of the future. Because I think, especially when we talk about the built environment and the use of land, amending how we use our land, it's a very lengthy process in many cases, and it's going to take the amending of laws. It's going to, at the local level, we will have to amend our statutory planning systems, our land use plans, these things take time. And so again, I think I need to stress the fact that we should be acting now. In terms of the general trend that we should be following is, again, I think that we should be promoting as much as possible the densification of our built environments. One basic thing that I think we could be doing is integrating population projections into our land use and spatial planning frameworks. That could take the form of, for example, setting settlement boundaries, development boundaries, and then also making them flexible enough so that whenever you have a new land use plan or a spatial plan in 5 or 10 years, that you can review them and make them flexible, and then review the boundaries as appropriate. I think also we should be utilizing transit-oriented development as much as possible, especially in the areas in the periphery of urban areas. And we should also be setting minimum density requirements in the areas that are expanding. In terms of infrastructure and services, I think in order to improve the efficiency, that we need to be integrating different services into regional or local services centers. And in order to do that, I think we should be incorporating digitization as much as possible. And also, in order to, again, integrate the services into regional centers, another key important thing that at the OECD we always stress, but it's often difficult implement is strengthening the regional level. Oftentimes you see, in many cases, local governments and municipalities, in the early stages at least of when they see declining population rates, they are in a sort of a state of denial, and they resort to various tax incentives that are aimed at attracting firms and people into their regions in the hope that it's going to reverse the demographic trends. The issue with that is that if you do that without a regional focus, it turns into a sort of a zero-sum game where all of the municipalities are all doing that, and at the end of the day, the local governments are just giving off tax incentives and tax breaks, and it has no real implication in terms of the actual location of firms or economic activity or people. And so again, we need to be strengthening this regional level in order to promote a more coherent response to the demographic challenge. And in order to do that, I think we need to be encouraging intermunicipal cooperation as much as possible. And I think there the national government has a role to play in providing the financial incentives to promote cooperation between local municipalities. Another key thing I think that I wanted to stress is that we really need to be focusing financial and economic resources into promoting the renovation of our built environments, and also we need to be financing and supporting demolition efforts in places in empty places. And there are already some examples of places that have begun or actually have done that in the past decades. For example, the Stadtumbau program in East Germany was, I mean, you can debate whether it was successful or not, but it was at the very least a large-scale effort and that the national government was that implemented that was successful in at least funding the demolition of empty housing and also the renovation of deteriorating urban cores. I think I can. I'll end my intervention by emphasizing the fact that the current structure of land use frameworks is we don't internalize all of the externalities that arise from shrinking populations and people living in sparse areas. And so I think as a general sort of a direction is that we need to be emphasizing and we need to be implementing measures so that we can internalize those externalities. By, for example, I mean, if there is, I don't know, a house in the middle of nowhere, then there needs to be some sort of a mechanism in order to internalize the fact that if a person chooses to live there, it's okay. I mean, of course, we can't force people not to live anywhere, not to live there. But I mean, we need to internalize the fact that the governments that are providing their services and infrastructure to those areas, it's on a per capita basis much more expensive than people that are, let's say, living in urban centers. And again, I think I come back to the point that I want to stress is that because of the fact that the use of land and real estate, it's such a sticky sort of thing that we really should be acting now.
Okay, thanks. We had already quickly touched on the question of equity basically before, and Josefina, what can we do to ensure that the demographic gaps that we're seeing are not going to be leading to equity gaps, and what role may there be for governance structures to influence that?
Yeah, that's also a very relevant question. When we talk about this issue, how to plan for a shrinking future, it's quite often that we end up with discussions about budget cuts, doing things more efficiently, demolishing houses and the withdrawal of the state at different levels. And that, of course, doesn't lead to anything good. It leads to populism, it leads to less trust in public institutions, it leads to polarization, etc. So I think we really need to sort of develop some kind of policy language on how do we aim to deal with this issue on various levels of government. And I presented a paper for OECD last year where I introduced as a tricycle model, which is a model with 3 circles, where the inner circle is the core, where we find local government adaptation policy. And there is what we expect local governments to do to adapt to new demographic conditions. And here we find these things like housing policy, densification, efficiency. Sometimes in some areas we have raising taxes, we have digitalization, we have collaboration between municipalities, collaboration with the civil society, etc. And that sort of policy circle, it has to be there. But that circle also needs to be embedded in state goals of territorial equality and cohesion, as you talked about, because these places cannot be just left behind and to solve their own businesses. I think that these interventions, they can be financial, but maybe we also need, at least in a Nordic context, to discuss also asymmetries when it comes to how things are done. Because at least in the Nordic countries, we have a very strict idea about how services should be provided, under what conditions, in order to make them equal. But perhaps in order to get the equal service, we have to provide them differently. And that's what I talk about, place-based solutions. So in some parts of the Nordic countries, we may need to accept digital teaching of pupils in school, even if we do not do that in the bigger cities. However, I would also like to stress that the provision of public goods, of services of general interest, they cannot be offered only by local governments who are adapting, or by governments who sort of offer some kind of financial or structural support. We also need vibrant communities. We need places where people can live, where people are willing to live and work, pay taxes. So I would call for some kind of a mid-layer where we talk about policies for local economic sustainability. It might not be growth. It might not be that these places are growing in terms of people or finances, but at least they should be economically sustainable. And if I search for policies aiming at local economic sustainability in plans, in comprehensive plans in the Nordic countries, they talk about tourism, about strategies for skills provision, strategies for entrepreneurialism, for diversification, etc. But I think much more can be done in that sort of mid-layer of this policy model. So I think that in order to make policies and planning for depopulation not being just budget cuts and withdrawal of the state, I think we need to develop these kind of ideas of how what policy interventions we need. And I also think that we as scholars, we need to collaborate more over these sort of policy theories, so to say. I would say that we have a bunch of scholars who worked for decades on planning for shrinkage. But they did not collaborate very much with those who study regional development policy on the state or European level. So I think we need to make a link between these two academic circles as well.
You mentioned that basically, I mean, there's also a need for, place-based policies, which I certainly subscribe to, because that's what we're also pushing very strongly in the OECD. We're having a report that's coming out very soon on the future of place-based policies. But you also kind of like a little auto-promotion, sorry. But you also said that there's a lack of multi-level initiatives. Why is that so?
Yeah, if I talk from a Swedish experience, I would say that it's quite easy to allocate a sum of money for a certain period and then ask local governments to solve a problem or to do something. But they still have to solve the problem or do something within the same institutional framework that were there before, and the same institutional framework that the growing urban cities are dealing with. And that means that they are asked to do something with money that doesn't really, but act within a structure that doesn't really work. So I think if multi-level governance is not about the state government sort of providing local governments with money, it's also about understanding the conditions under which they work.
Okay, thanks a lot. So basically we had these 2 rounds of discussions among us, and I would like now also to bring in the audience. So if you have any questions that you would like to ask, I mean, you're very welcome to do so. I would otherwise, I mean, we were then going to a next round where we're answering your questions, and I would also then maybe suggest that we have had some examples, but we have also kind of like discussing concepts more in a bit like theoretical way, which I guess is fine for an academic conference, but maybe we could also kind of like get a bit more concrete and talk a bit about more some examples of regions, cities, countries that have been doing some policies, I mean, connected to the topics we've been discussing, that have been either particularly successful or particularly unsuccessful, because I mean, also from the failures, I mean, that's maybe sometimes where we can learn most from. So, I mean, but before, I mean, I start this round, are there any questions in the public that you would like to ask? So how do we get you up the mic? Jay, okay. No, we should get you the mic. I mean, people will not hear you otherwise. Please, I mean, just, tell us also your name and your affiliation before you ask a question.
Thank you. Stefan Bruno from the University of Applied Labor Studies in Germany. Thank you very much for this interesting, ideas. And I totally agree with this issue on the funding of infrastructure, basically schools and so on, not just the roads, but every kind of infrastructure. And as I come from East Germany, we have very good experience with shrinking after the reunification. Of course, many of you may have heard from it. There was a large outflow of individuals from this area out migrating to western parts of Germany. And we basically have these problems now for 30 years. My question is now how to deal with it in a sense of the organization of politics. According to our standard theory, we would suggest to have the principle of subsidiarity that basically states, okay, you can solve the problems at the lowest level, which includes all the external factors, so that no additional external factors are present. But this would mean in a shrinking society that we have to enlarge our areas, our regions, because not the single region, say in Germany now it's a Kreis or a small region, can solve the conflict anymore, so we should raise it to a higher level. So this would speak for, in German terms, at the NUTS 2 or even NUTS 1 level, so the federal states, or even further to the level of Germany, similar things for other countries, or even the EU level to solve these infrastructure conflicts. What do you think about it? Which is the appropriate level to address politics? Thank you.
Any other question? Just raise your hand, we have a mic.
Thank you. Very quickly, how concrete would you believe that a massive immigration policy would be to address this? The Roman Empire did that in the end of the 3rd century because there was a major pandemic of smallpox, and so 30% or so of the population disappeared over a generation. There was not enough workforce for the agricultural activities, for handcrafts, not enough workforce for the army, and there was we're not sure how forceful, how cooperative approach to bring in people from outside the boundaries to release Roman citizenship to the rest of the world. And for a couple of generations it worked, then other problems arose, but how concrete is this solution right now? How likely it is that we bring in Ukrainians, we bring in Moroccans, we're talking about concrete people with skills and families and a life to bring in to release European citizenship and to counterbalance this decline in population. Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, I would then basically, turn back to the round. Maybe we can do it in the inverse sense now. Maybe Josefina, do you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Thank you for the question. I can try to start to answer, and then I can hand the microphone over. I think once again I'm talking from a perspective of the Nordic countries, and there we have I would say that we have this model that things should be solved in the same way, irrespectively of the local conditions of that place. And I can easily come across several examples. One is that every municipality has to collect food waste from food from the houses. Every place where you have elder people should have a night guard. In every place where you have a lake, you cannot build a house on a certain distance from that lake in order to protect the area for being exploited by people. But if you come to places in the really remote peripheral areas where people have been taking care of their food waste for forever, and where you have no one who wants to build a house around a lake, and if there comes someone who wants to build a house, that would be a perfect contribution to that place, etc. They still have to conform to national sort of legislation. And the reason is, of course, that citizens should have the same services and the same rights irrespectively of where we live. But I think that maybe it's time to talk about asymmetry. Maybe it's time to talk about doing things differently depending on the place-based conditions. And that speaks in favor of subsidiarity, as you proposed, I would say. Yeah. Maybe someone want to add something to that?
Do you want to say something either on the questions or on the examples?
I guess the first question on the appropriate political level, I think there are examples, at least, sorry, excuse me, in OECD countries where to tackle the issues of depopulation and decline, some OECD countries have resorted to municipal mergers, for example. And there are, for example, in Estonia, they used to have over 200 municipalities, and I believe now the number is less than 100. And so that was a very drastic change that they implemented. But I think generally, when we talk about municipal mergers, first of all, they're very difficult politically. So, in terms of whether they're feasible is one question that we need to be answering. And second of all, I think I don't think we need to resort to such lengths in order to address the demographic challenge more appropriately. I think the point that I was raising before about the need for a regional cooperation framework and intermunicipal cooperation, I think the fact that the municipalities have a way in order to cooperate to address these challenges collectively, I think is important. And whether, I mean, it might not be the case that we need to resort to municipal mergers, but I mean, if that's not the case, then we need some type of cooperation mechanism at the local level, and I think that's important going into the future.
If I may abuse the fact that I'm just having the mic to add on that one, I mean, there is certain places in Germany that where, I mean, a lot of people think it would make a lot of sense to kind of like merge some of the city-states with some surrounding state, but where basically for political reason that's been considered dead, and that's a bit what Jay's been saying as well. I mean, like France is another example where having more than 30,000 municipalities, everybody knows that a lot of them are basically too small to function. But nobody in France is even suggesting that they should be merged because that would be political suicide. But then, I mean, there is other ways around that. I mean, in France, for example, they have been coming up with, basically communal groupings where certain functions are then basically transferred from the municipalities to these communal groupings. And so I think the answer to your question is, to a certain degree, obviously sometimes administrative changes can make a lot of sense. And if they can be done, then it's useful, but in a lot of countries that may be very tricky. And then one can kind of like come up with substitutes for that. And then it's also very important how you design these substitutes. For example, one of the problem these communalities in France have, that they're basically having indirectly elected people who are running them, and then given that they're not directly elected, they're having a very strong stand against the mayors who are saying, I'm directly elected, so what are you telling me, basically? So I mean, I'm just saying the design of these frameworks, of these governance frameworks, is incredibly important, and it's incredibly tricky, and obviously it really depends on which country you're looking at, because I mean, there's no two countries where you can basically, I mean, the one size fits all really doesn't work there. You really need to adapt it to the local situations. With that little intervention from my side, sorry, I pass on the mic.
Do you want to talk about the first question or the second? I would like to talk about the second question, where I'm maybe more knowledgeable, and I don't think you have to go back to the Roman Empire to find these examples where we attracted migrants. I mean, where I live in Austria, we had the Gastarbeiter policy in the 1960s, 1970s that really replenished the population. I mean, the population of Vienna in the 1970s was an old city with only old ladies, basically, and then it was replenished with these policies. So the only thing that they didn't envisage at that time is that the Gastarbeiter, the guest workers, came and they stayed. So it was thought like they would live after. So the other ways were like the Gulf countries, and the Gulf countries have different approach. So they bring the workers and then with a certain limited time, and then send them back home. So there are all these male workers. So of course there is a possibility to welcome, I mean, to host, to attract migrants, and I think the way it's going, we are more following nowadays the Canadian, Australian models of selective migration, so like cherry picking who we need at the moment for our labor force, rather than opening the borders, saying like, okay, please come to, I mean, at least I'm talking about Europe, at least come to Europe and then work. And I think we have also, so there have been calculations, I don't have the numbers with me, but the UN at one point tried to look at the numbers of migrants that would be needed to compensate for loss in population growth. And these were huge numbers, and numbers that, because as I said in my presentation before, because the migrants, they come and they also age, and they also adapt, integrate, and adopt the demographic behavior of the population that is local. So even bringing like people from high fertility countries doesn't mean that they will continue to have high fertility and have more children. So they are, so yeah. I mean, I don't know exactly what was your question, how realistic or not it was, but I think it's not the way governments are envisaging the future.
I'm happy to take the first question for two reasons, actually. The first one is that in my previous life, I was living in Turingen, in Jena, So I spent 4 great years there. Also because it's a territory where we used to bring one example of the dark side, let me use this music example, and one on the bright. You remember in my previous intervention I was mentioning the issue of the median age, which is a problem with the increase basically all across Europe. Virtually all Eastern Germany, all the regions in Eastern Germany are among the top in terms of increase in the median age. And this is, again, without repeating myself, rolls up into issues related to political development, so on and so forth. On a bright side, a great example, since we are talking about examples, that I like to mention, especially when we are in touch with the regional governments, Ministry of Education in other member states, is a program that the federal ministry, together with the Saxonian government back in 2008, developed in Germany in order to foster mobility of university students from the west to the east. I think it's very inspiring. It goes exactly in the direction of what, as I was mentioning before, making territories feeling that excellence is coming to you. You don't have always to live. It's a two-way mobility. And if market fades on this, we can develop creative ways in order to bring cohesion, literally cohesion, through education, through research to those territories. It's very inspiring. Believe me, not in other member states such attempts have been put in place. It's something very important. Now, another example, and then to conclude on a more general remark. On the multi-level. In the Recovering and Resilience Facility of the Spanish government, there is a high-level committee working on the population. Basically, in the National Plan for Economic Resilience, which is the major EU funds that was deployed following the COVID crisis, basically there are 130 initiatives at the central level against the population. And there is a strong attention in a country like Spain on the population. For instance, the Bank of Spain in a recent report indicated that almost 45%, 43%, of the municipalities in Spain are under the population risk. No similar statistics are comparable in other member states. Why I'm mentioning this? To provide 2 different examples of cooperation between different levels and actually of integration at the highest central level of the policy target of fighting the population. Why? Now I come to the issue, not so much of subsidiarity, but rather on reframing some of the policy and funds that we put in place. At the EU level, we touch, let me say another thing. I consider extremely relevant, we as a community of regional analysts, scientists, to analyze the issue of policies beyond cohesion policy, beyond territorial policies as such. The place-based approach can be a framework to be applied virtually to all policies. We don't need to be confined ourselves only to what is meant to be regional policy. Education policy, fiscal policy, even climate policy, industry-specific policy, everything in principle has a territorial dimension. Through the different angles under which the territorial problem can be tackled, urban versus rural, NUTS2, within countries, so on and so forth. At the EU level, we have different policy frameworks that target different policy objectives, but in which the territorial dimension is still there. Now, without going into details, but basically, in the most centralized program for research and innovation that we have, the Horizon program, there is a widening chapter, which is tackling the issue of increasing participation to RNI programs of lagging regions. 1/3 of the budget is going to what we call the European Structural Investment Funds. It's a share management program in which EU level, national level through the national plans, and regional level through the regional operational programs, a different mix of those, basically are administering under several pillars of deployment, policy targets, 1/3 of the EU budget. Now, the most recent is what I was mentioning before, the Next Generation EU, which is a major EU funding program. We will see in the post-27, the EU, we work with 7 years, we call it multi-annual financial framework, and now there is already the ongoing discussion on the design of what will be the post-27. The Next Generation EU is a fund managed at the central level by each member state, but there are 2 important elements where the territorial dimension is there. First, there are 6 pillars of intervention, and 1 specifically is mentioning territorial cohesion. The second one is the regulation for the implementation of it is basically the same of cohesion policy. So funds across member states have been distributed also in the Next Generation EU, basically by applying the regulatory framework of cohesion policy. Why am I mentioning this? Then there are different interplay at the thematic level. The twin transition of the Next Generation EU is basically equivalent to the different pillars of thematic intervention that we have under cohesion policy. Is that because the territorial element is there. Even when it doesn't appear, if we scratch a bit the surface, we will see a lot of elements for interpretation, analysis, monitoring, and evaluation in which the territorial place-based approach is relevant for policy development.
If I may add to the question on migration, basically, I mean, to echo what Anne's been saying, I mean, the first is the political economy question. Basically, even if from an economic point of view, it obviously, I mean, could be a solution. I don't think that the political economy in Europe, for example, would be, or in Japan or in Korea would be allowing for migration at a scale where this would really be kind of like compensating for the population shrinking that's predicted in those countries. And then the second point is that even if that did happen, I mean, then migrants are even more strongly oriented towards the larger urban centers than the original population in the country. So if there were large-scale migrants coming, I mean, a lot of them would not be going to the regions where we're having shrinking, but a lot of them would be going to the larger cities. So that would only be of limited help. I mean, some of them obviously are going, and maybe then also some of the native population maybe then relocating to the more remote regions. But I mean, it would also be of limited help for that. And the example of Rome, where you were talking, if I understood it was a disease, I mean, I would guess that the disease probably also depopulated to a large degree the urban areas. So in that sense, maybe that's also that policy worked better than because of that. I think you didn't answer that much on my question on an example. So what I would like to do, I mean, if somebody wants to ask some questions, so that's your last chance, so please raise your hand. But otherwise, then I would just ask you to kind of like, as a concluding panel, to basically for each of you give one example of a relevant policy that has been either in some place that has been spectacularly successful or kind of like a total failure. So that would be interesting as a case study. And then maybe if you want to say some concluding words also, or comment on anything that has been said, then I mean, you're also very welcome to. So any final question from the public? Not really? Then I mean, I will pass on the floor for the last round.
Okay, I start then? Yeah. If I should bring up a good example, I would mention a few examples where the state governments in different Nordic countries have provided local governments with funding to actually elaborate on their problems and to define the problems and to find solutions. And that's to give funding for this investigatory or planning part of an intervention is important, because small municipalities with shrinking populations rarely have these finances or these resources to work with knowledge formation or with planning. Providing local governments with funding to actually make those plans or to define the problems is something that I would encourage. And then I would like to return to, we had a keynote this morning or around lunch that I really liked. It encouraged us to go outdoors, to actually collaborate with planners, practitioners, politicians, policymakers who do the job, and that's what I really do. We need to have close collaboration in order to get to know the conditions under which they work, and in order to be relevant. So that's my suggestion.
I guess in terms of examples, there are a few. For example, in East Germany, the Stadtumbau program was one example that I briefly mentioned before. But I wouldn't say it was 100% a successful program, but I think it was important in the fact that, as Josefina was mentioning, the fact that local governments rarely have the resources or the funding in order to address adequately the issues that arise because of shrinkage. And so at least I think for that program in East Germany, it was successful in funneling national level funds into the urban renewal and efforts, and in particular demolition efforts, which are quite costly in many cases. So I think that's. But then again, you can say that there are some critics of the program that suggest that it was too much focused on demolition and not enough focused on urban renewal. And there are other criticisms as well. But I think the fact that there was a large-scale effort of the national government trying to promote these local governments by providing them funding to implement some of these key policies, I think is one example that we can possibly build upon. I think in terms of municipal cooperation, there aren't that many good examples, but I guess, again, I think I mentioned the example of Estonia that actually resorted to a large-scale mergers of municipalities. You can also consider the example of the spatial planning conference that's present in Austria, which brings together different municipalities under a coherent spatial planning framework. That's one common example that the OECD often uses as being partially successful in promoting the cooperation between municipalities. Other than that, I think because I think in general, I think it's very difficult to come up with very good examples that are applicable across the board, because it's true for not only the phenomenon of depopulation, but any sort of territorial phenomena, is the fact that it's how we address it is going to be very different depending on, for example, the location of whether the region is close to an urban center, or whether it's very remote, or whether it's a second-tier city, or whether it's a very large city. So I mean, it's one of the reasons why at the OECD we promote this sort of thing of where policy experimentation. I think, and especially when we talk about depopulation, it's something that the human race has never really had to face, apart from wars, pandemics, or famines, that type of thing. And so I think now it's going to be very important that we start acting now, and that we have sort of a more experimental view on trying to see which policies work in which type of regions and which policies don't. So.
I mentioned the German example before, but let's stick to something more related to the EU budget then. There are quite a lot of examples. So let me do a quick general remark, and then I go to the closest example I have in Sevilla, in the city where I'm living, where our Jersey Institute is hosted. But basically, the general remark is the following. We have plenty of examples, of course, at the project level of successful stories on cohesion policy, ranging from social inclusion to infrastructure to support to creative industries to green and digital transition, many of those things. However, sometimes, especially cohesion policy, comes under fire because of the lack of convergence. Now, I think from an analytical point of view, it's important to disentangle the general trend and the policy intervention. An exercise that from time to time we do at comparative level is basically by comparing big macro area like the European Union and the United States. Basically, in absence of fiscal stabilizer, automatic fiscal stabilizer in the European Union, basically it's more difficult to reach cohesion. The fiscal stabilizer component is what is driving more equalization across American states, North American states. So it's important to take into account the overall governance of the process. When we consider the real magnitude of the policies process at play, then some phenomenon and the impact can be measured in a more appropriate way. To rephrase what I'm saying, basically, if we consider the cohesion policy is 1/3 at the moment of a EU budget, which is not huge, but basically is equivalent to 1% more or less of the GDP, we are talking about very sizable differences between the automatic territorial stabilizer existing in one macro area vis-a-vis another. So we cannot ask cohesion policy to perform a role that basically belongs to fiscal, which at the moment is mostly national, at the national level. Now, we have estimated in the cohesion report that I was mentioning before, you have the macro figures. We estimated roughly 1.3, a multiplier of 1.3 basically generated for each euro invested in cohesion policy in 2030. This type of estimates are made through macroeconomic model. The one we use is the Romolo model, which we develop exactly for assessing this type of impact assessment at the NUTS2 level. But basically, beyond the big picture, there is some concrete examples that are worth mentioning. Now, again, I go back to Seville, I close my example. In the city, we have developed through EU money, basically one of the most advanced cycling networks, bike lanes of all European cities, starting from scratch, from nothing, in 2005. This was done thanks to EU money, but I consider this example quite relevant for the following reason. Especially when it comes to change cultural habit of the people, the beauty of policies that are leveraging on a sovereign national, sovereign territorial policy objective is that you can try to change behavior through funding. And the example on the green transition and on the green mobility goes exactly in this direction. In many cases, we have local communities. Actually, I could mention to you that in many countries in Southern Europe, the issue of light mobility, sustainable mobility becomes a topic when there are local electoral campaigns. But basically, through EU money, we can leverage and change the culture in some areas, and then developing a kind of virtuous cycle literally, of behaviors that can then generate additional changes in the cities. Some of the ingredients were this type of infrastructure, the urban regeneration programs that were coming at the same time in which, thanks to the deployment of bike lanes, we were making cities pedestrians. So basically bringing to life again, free of cars, some entire areas of cities that were basically neglected. This has basically brought a kind of renaissance in many cities, changing the quality of life of the people, in general the cultural beauties of the places where we live or where we travel to see.
That's almost the last word. I don't have any example. My work is mostly on the global south, so I have many examples of like success stories, like Bangladesh managing to reduce its fertility rate by policies, spreading family planning, and China also successful policy, coercive policy, now trying to go reverse, not being so successful. And this thing. But one thing that I really like and that Jay mentioned and was this introduction of population projections to policy planning. And I thought it's an excellent idea also, because when we talk about depletion or increasing, it's just about absolute numbers that have not much meaning, because these people, they have an age, they have a gender, they have skill, they have an education, they come from different places, they are migrants, they have different religions, and so on. And this is very important at the local level. So who are these people? How are they going to develop? So if we think of projection, how many children are they going to have? How educated are they going to become? How are they likely to move outside? So I think this is something, and it's my business. It's how I make my bread earn my bread every day. But I think this is very important, and that would be my last word. Thank you.
On that, I mean, some of you may know, but that's a bit of a fun fact. When you are aggregating population projections which are done at local level, I mean, typically you're ending up with very massive population growth, even if in reality, I mean, your population is stagnating, actually shrinking. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, putting a kind of like a reality check in there is certainly something that could be extremely helpful for, I mean, avoiding people at the local level making the wrong decisions. With that, I would like to close the sessions. I think we had a really fantastic discussion. I'm not going to, try to summarize it, because I mean it's been so rich. I mean that's not really very useful. I just wanted to kind of reiterate something I had been saying in the beginning. So maybe we have been able to convince you a bit more that looking at demographic change is actually something that's really interesting and really important going forward. In some countries, I mean, or in some places, we're still having increasing populations. I mean, that also, I mean, needs a certain, amount of policies. But that's something we didn't want to focus on today. Today, we wanted to focus on the opposite side, which is a bit more new, at least in modern times. So looking at the shrinking side. And so if any of you in the future will have, an envy to basically either do some research or do some kind of like, application helping municipalities or regions to adapt to what's going to happen to them on the demographic side, then we would think that our session would have achieved their goal. With that, I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for your patience and your enthusiasm, your great questions, and especially the people on the panel with me. So Anne and Andrea on my left, and Josephine and Jay on my right. And with that, I mean, maybe let's give a hand of applause to the panelists.